Are moral principles relative to a culture or an individual? Or are there moral principles that are objective, that apply to all people at all times? In this video, we consider the latter view, called objectivism, and we'll take a little time to consider absolutism, and we're focusing on the way that Lewis Poyman presents his arguments on this topic. The first thing that Poyman does is he argues that subjectivism fails. Subjectivism is a particular type of moral relativism, and it's the view that says that all moral principles are relative to an individual. This is an intuitive view that many people have. They say something like, morality is just a matter of opinion. It all depends on the person. Whatever the person says, that's what determines what's morally right or wrong. However, when you take it very seriously, you can draw out consequences that are extremely problematic. So, if subjectivism is correct, if moral principles solely are based on what individuals believe and do, then individuals such as Hitler or Eric Harris, the Columbine shooter, or suicide bombers, they were doing something morally good when they killed many innocent people because they believed what they were doing was right, and they followed through on that belief. And so according to subjectivism, that's the end of the story. There are no moral principles that apply to all people at all times, so there's no standard above and beyond the individual. That's the end of the story. Of course, the problem is that Hitler, Eric Harris, suicide bombers were not doing something morally good when they killed many innocent people. And so we conclude from that that subjectivism is not correct. Now that's significant enough argument. Poyman believes that should convince everyone. However, he does have another argument. And the argument goes like this. If subjectivism is correct, then we cannot disagree about moral principles. So the idea is, suppose you loan a friend $50. They say they'll pay it back when they get paid on Friday, and you see the person on Monday and you ask for the $50 back. Suppose your friend says, no, I don't believe in returning money just because I promised. I think I'm the best person to handle money, and so I took your money and I did what I wanted with it, and I trust me more than you, and so I'm not giving you any money back. Now we have a disagreement, it seems. You say it's morally wrong for that person, your friend, not to give the money back, but your friend now says it's morally right for him to keep the money. Seems like a disagreement. Well, if subjectivism is correct, though, all you are doing is saying it's morally wrong for me to borrow money and not pay it back. I wouldn't do that. I consider it morally wrong. But you can say nothing about your friend's moral principles. And so if subjectivism is correct, we can't actually disagree about moral principles. And Poyman says the problem is, of course, we can and do disagree about moral principles. And so subjectivism is not correct. Then Poyman turns his sights on conventionalism, the idea that moral principles are relative to a culture, and there are no objective moral principles. And he first considers, why do people think that conventionalism is correct? And roughly, here's an argument. The beliefs about moral rightness and wrongness of actions vary from society to society. And whether or not it's right for individuals to act in a certain way simply depends on the society to which they belong. Very intuitive principles here setting out. This is one presented by anthropologists in the past. And then we say, well, if 2 is correct, that is, if whether or not something's right for an individual to act in a certain way does depend on the society to which they belong, well, then there are no objective moral standards at all. It is determined by the culture or society that one is in. And so we have the conclusion that there are no objective moral standards. That's the negative claim of conventionalism. The positive claim is that premise two. And so we have conventionalism here. But what might be wrong with the argument? Poiman says the argument fails. First of all, that diversity thesis, that is the idea that there is a great variety of beliefs amongst different societies, actually isn't so clear-cut. When two societies differ about an apparent moral claim, for example, the anthropologist Ruth Benedict studied a society where people were considered morally wrong if they tried to share their food when other people were hungry and needed food. It was morally wrong to share. And obviously that's very different from our culture, which says it would be morally right to share. So it seems like there's a disagreement there among moral principles. But Poiman says, no, wait a minute. Benedict also found out that the society that believed it was morally wrong to share was obsessed with poison. And the concern there was that the other person might try to poison you by sharing food. And the bottom line there was both our culture and that culture believed that to poison somebody else is morally wrong. So actually, there's an underlying moral principle that both cultures held. And Poiman says that's fairly common. Many of the apparent differences from culture to culture are not really applications of different moral principles. When you look at them more carefully, you see similar moral principles. Now, he doesn't say it's false. He does agree that there are cases where there are moral principles that are different, but it doesn't seem to be as overwhelming as one might think at the beginning. He then argues against that dependency thesis, the idea that whether or not something's morally wrong fully depends on the culture to which the person belongs. He says these are two different things. What values the various cultures endorse may be different from what moral principles actually exist. An analogy to illustrate this point is, suppose there are two different cultures and both of them have ideals about losing weight. And one culture says the best way to do it is to exercise and to eat a healthy diet, one that's moderate and has a wide variety of healthy foods. A different culture says the best way to lose weight is not to exercise, but eat all you want on one day, high-calorie foods, whatever you feel like, and then the next day you just don't eat at all. And then you just alternate that system. Well, it could be that two different cultures have these different beliefs, but that doesn't mean in one of them you lose weight by doing feasting and fasting, and the other you don't. You just aren't going to lose weight by feasting and fasting, and you would by exercising and having a healthy diet. And so Poiman says, why not think that morality is like that? And then Poiman turns his attention to a different argument against conventionalism. So he's focusing on reform. And he says, if moral truths are relative to a culture, then a change in cultural standards cannot be a correction of an error. That seems to be the case. If you're changing a cultural standard, it might evolve, it might be different, but you could not say that one was better than another. And the problem is that some changes in cultural standards are corrections of an error. So, for example, reformation of racial policies, the efforts of Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr., and others to change the way we treat races in the United States differently, those efforts improved the culture. They were moral improvements. But if conventionalism is correct, that would be impossible. Whatever is morally right and wrong is fully determined by the culture in which one is in. And so the previous state of segregation and discrimination, if that's what was culturally accepted, that's what was morally right, and you can't improve on that because there's no standard that's above and beyond the culture that says it's morally wrong. Now, the real concern that Poyman has is that as a result, you would have to say that Martin Luther King Jr., for example, was immoral in his efforts at reform because he was going against the cultural standards of the day. And that's what determines is morally right or wrong. And so you put these two premises together, and you can conclude that moral truths are not relative to a culture. If you believe that two is true, one just follows from the definition of conventionalism, then you would believe three. Here's another concern, an argument that Poyman raises against conventionalism. And he says if moral truths are relative to a culture, then one should never judge the values of another culture. Now, those who are proponents of conventionalism fully endorse this premise. They say, on this point, you are right. You're drawing out an implication that is correct. And anthropologists, sociologists, many people would endorse this and say, in fact, moral truths are relative to a culture, and we should never judge the values of another culture. I mean, who are we to judge another culture? But Poyman says, wait a minute, sometimes one should judge the values of people of another culture. For example, the Nazis, the Indians, when they practiced burning the widows on the funeral pyre of the deceased husband, the cultures that practice slavery or oppression of women. We are right to make moral judgments about them and to say that those activities are morally wrong. And so we conclude that moral truths are not relative to a culture, in contrast to the claims of conventionalism. Here's another concern that Poyman has against conventionalism, and the concern is that it reduces itself to subjectivism, which he is thoroughly convinced is incorrect. The problem is, how do you tell which culture or even subculture to which one belongs? So imagine there's a student at Western Illinois University who is Catholic, an American, is a student at the university, is a Midwesterner, belongs to PETA and the sorority Delta Zetas. So imagine you have such an individual. Well, what does this individual do when issues come up like the morality of eating meat? As a Midwesterner, as a university participant who has an ag business program that we fully support, a lot of that has to do with eating meat, raising meat for consumption. As a member of PETA, though, that would be considered morally wrong. So what's the individual to do? Identify themselves as with the culture of the university and the Midwestern culture, or identify themselves with the culture of PETA? Now, it seems to be up to the individual to choose in that situation. And if that's the case, and you have all these, everyone has these various subcultures to which they can identify, and so you have everyone just picking and choosing what moral principles they're going to endorse, and that ends up being subjectivism, right? Eventually, conventionalism reduces to the much more implausible subjectivism. So what do we have instead? Objectivism and absolutism are the alternatives. First, let's take absolutism. It's the belief that there are non-overridable moral principles that ought never to be violated. So there are moral principles that should not be violated by anyone at any time in any place, no matter what culture they're in, no matter what the individual believes. That's absolutism. Now, objectivism is not as strong, we might say. Objectivism is the belief that there is at least one, and of course most objectivists think there are many more than one, but at least one universal objective moral principle that is binding on all people everywhere in some ideal sense. Now, that phrase, in some ideal sense, is a qualifier, right? In certain circumstances, an objective moral principle might be violated. It might be morally good to do so, but only when it conflicts with another objective moral principle that is more important. So, for example, telling the truth. It's an objective moral principle that applies to all people at all times. However, there might be individual circumstances where it could conflict with a greater moral principle. So, for example, a family harboring a Jewish family in their home in 1930s Germany, and the Gestapo comes to the door and they say, "Are you hiding a Jewish family in your house?" Now, if you tell the truth, that family is going to be killed immediately or sent to concentration camps. It's going to be of great harm to them. And so you have to weigh which is the more important moral principle. They both apply to everyone at all times, but in this case, you cannot possibly fulfill both protecting innocent life from severe harm and telling the truth. So you have to make a choice. That's what Poyman is talking about by having these apply in some ideal sense. Now, how do you argue for objectivism? Well, Poyman says it's actually fairly easy. All that's needed to show that objectivism is true and relativism is false, relativism of both kinds, conventionalism and subjectivism, all you need to do is for there to be one moral principle that does not vary according to a culture or an individual. And if you have one, then you have an objective moral principle, and that's it. That means relativism is false. So there are several such principles. Poyman goes through a list of 10 or so. Here are a few. I've slightly modified a couple of these just to make it very clear and crisp here. It's morally wrong to torture innocent people for amusement. So this applies to all people at all times, Poyman argues. And if somebody were to raise to him the consideration of, well, wait a minute, what about the ancient Roman culture, which seemed to do just that? They tortured people for amusement on occasion. And people loved it, the culture endorsed it. And Poyman's response, of course, is, well, so much the worse for that culture, right? Even though they endorsed it, it was still morally wrong to do that. Another one might be that parents have a responsibility to care for their children. Or truth-telling is morally valuable. Kind of watered that one down, but certainly that's a moral principle that applies to all cultures at all times, says Poyman. So if we have these objective moral principles, that means morality is not relative to a culture or relative to an individual, and we do have these principles that do apply to all people at all time. Now, why does relativism seem so attractive? Poyman takes this consideration, and he has a few points. One is that it's often presented as the only alternative to absolutism. So people react to absolutism very negatively and say, oh, never violate it, and have concerns about that. So they go to a form of relativism. Poyman says, well, wait a minute, you haven't considered objectivism as an alternative. A second reason is that we've recently developed this very heightened sensitivity to ethnocentrism and unwarranted intolerance. So we have this idea that we should accept other cultures. It's built into principles. For example, Western Illinois University speaks of tolerance and acceptance of other perspectives and cultures and viewpoints. And so that lends itself well to somebody being a conventionalist, where we don't make any judgments about the activities and beliefs and practices of other cultures. And we also, ethnocentrism is the idea that one's own culture is morally superior to other cultures. And we don't want to say that about our culture. Now, what's interesting here is we're often willing to criticize our own culture, and that's endorsed as acceptable, even if all moral principles are relative to the culture within which they're in, it seems like you shouldn't be able to criticize your culture. But in any case, we are very sensitive to doing this. We don't want to make judgments of other people. And so that fits with conventionalism very well. And finally, Poyman mentions the decline of religion, the associated religious values, the transformation in the United States culture that's been taking place over the last 40 years or so. That leaves less support for objective moral principles. Often in the past, objective moral principles were presented, and then you had a basis for that by appealing to, especially in the United States, Christianity in particular, or a Judeo-Christian ethic in particular. And so with religion declining and fewer people identifying themselves as a religious believer of one kind or another, you don't have that common basis for moral principles. So that also lends itself to a form of conventionalism. Now notice these aren't arguments. Poyman is kind of giving an analysis why people are attracted to it, even though it is false, according to him. Now, we might raise a different question. Wait a minute, we've talked about judging other cultures, and Poyman says that that's a right thing to do. Well, who's to judge what's right? Who is Poyman to make judgments about other cultures? Who's Poyman to make judgments about our culture? Here's his response to that concern. Who's to judge? Poyman says, we are. Discovering objective moral truths might be like figuring out what happens after death. There's a fact of the matter, even if no one knows what that is. Now, there's a certain difference here. Clearly, we have a capacity to know moral truths, argues Poyman, whereas we don't have a natural capacity to know what happens after death. We have a capacity to know this. And so you may not be able to appeal to science or provide a good reason, an argument for basic moral principles that you firmly hold, that you have upon reflection, affirmed. But that's okay, because you rightly believe a lot of things that science and good arguments can't prove and can't support at all. That's fine. Now, this is a questionable epistemic view that I'm kind of pushing on to Poyman. He doesn't have this explicitly, but it seems like this fits. So, for example, you have beliefs about what you ate for breakfast yesterday, or maybe even 3 days ago. Well, if it's 3 days ago, there's no science that could prove what you did or didn't eat. There's no argument, if nobody else knows, that you could give that is convincing, other than based on you just believing anything that you say to begin with. The idea that your senses are reliable is problematic in this way. How do you know your senses are reliable? Well, you have to rely on your senses in order to verify what your senses are telling you. So there's a circular issue there, and that's again another epistemological concern. Let's get back to the bigger picture here. Who's to say what's right? Poyman says we're supposed to reflect carefully on what is morally right or wrong. And when we consider other cultures that disagree with us, or other individuals who disagree with us, we are to have empathy. We are to try to understand their viewpoint. If they have arguments, we are to listen carefully to them, and we may change our minds and find that we were wrong about our judgments. That's possible. But everyone is supposed to make moral judgments, says Poyman. There are objective moral truths. We are to do our best to identify those. We reason through these things. We think carefully about them. We are willing to criticize our own culture and ourselves. That is, to correct ourselves when we discover that we were wrong. And that puts us in a position to be able to judge who's right and who's wrong. And so Poyman says objectivism is actually very plausible. And when somebody who is reflective on what's going on there, he's convinced that you would agree with him that objectivism is the correct viewpoint.